We want to spend a few minutes on the podcast today considering whether Scotland is a good place to start a business. Just in the last few weeks, there have been so many reports and sets of data that suggest actually it's particularly difficult at the moment. Let's start with Judith Cruikshank, who is the Scotland board chair at RBS, saying that with inflation continuing to pressure companies and customers, the latest data in their growth tracker, which are for December, shows steeper increases in input prices at the end of the year, suggesting that margins are tightening. There's also a report from the UK accountancy body, ICAEW, revealing that business confidence in Scotland has slumped to its lowest level in more than 3 years. That's to say nothing, of course, of tax and wage cost increases emanating from changes in UK government policy, which are yet to show up fully. We're talking, of course, about the increase in employer national insurance contributions, which kicked in April last year, but they're sure to have more of an effect in the next financial year. So, is Scotland a good place to start a business? What conditions are required to be able to say yes as the answer to that question? Let's speak to Chris Hurd, who's General Manager at Firstbase. Hello, Chris.
Hey, Colin. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you. Yeah, you too. Shall we start here with what is Firstbase? What it is, what you did, how you started? Just tell us a little bit of the Firstbase story, I guess.
Yeah, happy to. So I think starting today, Firstbase is a single platform to equip teams and manage assets globally. And what that really focuses on is the IT equipment that people need to do the best work that they can. We started out doing that to supply remote workers pre-COVID. COVID happens, obviously accelerates the trend that we were betting on by 10 or 15 years overnight. And over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, we've grown to work with some of the fastest growing, most respected and admired technology companies in the world. So people like Spotify, Cloudflare, Wiz, Ramp, Mercury Bank. If you're a fast growing tech company, you probably would use Firstbase or could use Firstbase.
Yeah.
Tried to start that in Scotland, didn't really succeed. Moved to the States, and yeah, things turned out quite well.
I think that's kind of why we're exploring this, really, is because you felt you had to, I think it's fair to say, go to the US in order to make this thing work. Why was that? Why did you feel that?
Yeah, I think so. We started out initially building a slightly different business. That was a financial technology company. Couldn't really ever get it to work. Spoke to something like 139 investors between that and then the pivot to Firstbase. And the general answer was the same, whether we were speaking to people in Scotland or London, which was, this is super ambitious. You're probably not going to do this from here, and somebody in the States is going to do it before you. We heard that from, I think, venture capitalists, angel investment syndicates, individuals. And ultimately that was what transpired. Some of the states did do it, but it was us. We moved there. It turned out quite well. And yeah, I think that question for me has been there since. Why were the conditions such in Scotland that this couldn't materialize there? And yeah, in the last few years, I think I've spoken to a bunch of people and maybe have some clearer answers.
Yeah, and so let's get into those, because I guess maybe one way to do this is what was attractive about the US? What made it work there?
For me, it's just a very different conversation. I think the conversation I had here being more Scotland than the UK, it was very difficult to get people on the same side of the table as you. So almost every conversation started out from the perspective of, okay, but how do we mitigate the risk? How do we stop all stop the likelihood that this fails? And the reality with most startups is that's not possible, right? A startup's a startup for all the reasons that there is risk. The likelihood that any venture is going to fail is the majority of the time. Whereas when we went to the States, it felt like people were on the same side of the table as us, and really people were dreaming a little bit more. So it wasn't just how do we mitigate the risk, it was how big can this be if everything goes right? And that might seem like quite a small nuance to people that have never been in the space, but actually having people believe is the sort of necessary requirements early on to get anything off the ground.
And just for context, Chris, if I may pry a little, I mean, just put into context how successful Firstbase is as a company that could have started in Scotland and ultimately didn't.
Yeah, I think we're on the course to reaching 9 figures in revenue. Probably by the end of this year, we'll be within shooting distance of it. We raised just short of $70 million from the world's best investors. So people like Andreessen Horowitz, Kleiner Perkins. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So it's pretty mega, and that's something that had to walk away from Scotland in order to make it work. Is there anything that you sense could change immediately? How do you change the atmosphere in Scotland to make it a good place to start a business?
Yeah, it's sort of this odd dichotomy at the same time, Colin. It's actually like not a terrible place to start a business. So
Mm.
actually, like of all the places in the world, starting here might be easier than almost anywhere. And I mean getting off the starting line, right? So you raise the first 10, 15, 20K, whether it's in grants or other or some other funding. So that part actually isn't that difficult here. Arguably it's too easy actually. So everyone and anyone can actually get access to capital, and it's not clear to me that that leads to the level of competition that's required to create great businesses. So that's maybe a slightly different path. The next step beyond that, so raising the first like real institutional investment capital, the next 125 to 250K, I think is arguably harder in Scotland than anywhere else in the world. And that's really the first lump of capital that lets you hire, if you're building a software company, which is obviously the world I come from, that's the first lump of capital that lets you hire 1, 2 engineers. Maybe it lets you scale out operations or some other function. And because it's so hard here, it's not impossible, but because it's so hard and there are so few opportunities to raise that capital from, you end up with the people who are doing it in really punitive ways. So they're giving you 100K for 50% of your business. And the implication or consequence of that is once you get down to the next stage, you're going to raise 1 to 2 million at some valuation of, call it, between $5 and $12 million. You speak to real institutional investors, venture capitalists, and their reaction is dismay that your cap table looks the way it does, to the extent where it's almost uninvestable. And I think what happens in Scotland is those businesses generally have to leave to raise that next tranche. Like 1 to 2 million is hard here. They go and have those conversations, and unless it is a tier 1 business, and I mean in terms of growth rate, the venture capitalists, the investors look at it and they basically say, this cap table is not worth fixing, therefore we're not going to spend any more time on it. And I think the problem that we've had in Scotland is that feedback is often given through the lens of, we like the business, we need more data, come back in 6 or 12 months when you've had more opportunity to grow the business. And that's not necessarily the thing that's stopping the investment. The stopping the investment is, I as a venture capitalist can't put 1 or 2 million into this to own 10 or 20%, when somebody who put in 50K 6 months ago owns 50% of the business. It just doesn't make economic sense.
Yeah. Okay. Jeff, how do you feel listening to Chris's story and, hearing that nine figures are on the way by the end of the year, and actually perhaps the conditions in Scotland make it challenging as a place to kind of to progress, certainly at what may be a startup to begin with, but to kind of get to these sorts of levels that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, sadly, it's all too familiar, frankly. I'm going to say a few words so I remind myself to keep on a train of thought here. So startup to scale up, appetite for risk, access to finance, productivity, innovation, high value manufacturing, right? Those are my train of thought here. So when Chris talks about starting a business, actually, I think Scotland's got reasonably good evidence of that. There's startup support. I think the interesting point, what you said there, maybe it's too easy. At that point, I think there's something in that, but it's the scale up bit that we don't do well at all. It's that scaling up bit that really is where we're seeing businesses fall off a cliff. I've got about a handful of examples right now that I'm working with, trying to get them that access to finance, which brings me to the next point. We do not have an appetite for risk here. And the American culture has long since been able to say, look, we recognize we have to take a risk on you. This is how unicorns grow. This is how businesses flourish. Here, we're much more strict in terms of our unlocking of finance. Why is that? In my opinion, well, I think things changed dramatically after the 2008 financial crash. Every economic indicator says that the UK productivity has been very sluggish since then. It's not particularly good. Now, what really unlocks productivity is innovation. Innovation where there's high value manufacturing. So we have in Aberdeen, where Chris and I are both from, incidentally, we just found out prior to the call that his uncle runs a chipper, which has saved me from so many hangovers before I go home at night, by the way. I'm just going to say that. Dolphin chipper, right opposite taxi rank, superb. Anyway, right. So the point I was getting at here, though, is in the city that we're both from originally, there's something called bird funding. Now, that is bird analysis. Now, it's business on enterprise research and development. Now, bird as a share of GDP in the northeast of Scotland is way higher than the rest of the national average. And I'm not just talking about Scotland here, I'm talking about the UK. Why is that? Well, that was because of oil and gas, right? And people had that wonderful natural asset, that natural opportunity, and we had innovators in the supply chain making high-level technology. I'm sure Chris and I know heaps of people in this space who've developed their own technology because you had that opportunity. When I talk about oil and gas leaving prematurely and the disastrous policy of our government, I'm actually worried about that innovative supply chain companies going there. They had that opportunity because there was finance there to back them to do it. People were willing to take risk because they recognized that there was this overarching opportunity. Now, that was just unbelievably lucky, I suppose, when you've won the natural lottery. Point here is, how do we translate that success Scotland-wide and UK-wide? And it comes, as I say again, appetite for risk, access to finance, and we need to be more productive through innovation.
So what is that? Is there a kind of, is Scotland struggling because it's small, that there's not the same number of people? What's going on there at the heart?
I'm getting a bit annoyed with this, though. If I'm being honest with you, in Scotland, the economic levers largely, right? And this is not a political point, but it's just a fact. Monetary policy, international trade, immigration, employment law, corporation tax, national insurance contributions are all set by the UK government. These are the things that really engender economic growth. Could the Scottish government do more? Yes, it could. A hell of a lot more, quite frankly. It could do something around income tax. It could do something around stamp duty or LBTT that would try and unlock more finance in the system. But fundamentally, they do not have the levers at their disposal, apart from Scottish enterprise, to really motivate investment. What I do think the focus needs to be on, and what Chris tells us, is on how can we just bring a pool of investors together to support the startups that have established themselves to scale up to success. That, to me, is the trick here in what we're discussing.
Yeah. Chris, what do you think?
I mean, couldn't agree more. And I'd be even more aggressive on the side of innovation. If you take the historical legacy of Scotland, Scotland is one of the most entrepreneurial nations, not just in the UK or Europe, in the history of the world, right? You think about from the Industrial Revolution onwards, you've got the steam engine, the television, you've got penicillin, you've got the telephone, you've got economics, you've got logarithms. How long have you got, right? I can sit here for the next 20 minutes.
We also invented the overdraft. Very useful for this conversation.
Well, very, very useful for that. And so I think the consequence of all of those things, including insulin and refrigeration and the overdraft, is Scotland, that like the modern world wouldn't exist without Scotland and our entrepreneurs. And I don't think that's changed, right? Scottish people are some of the best placed in the world to be entrepreneurs just based on our natural being, right? We are resourceful, we're relentless, we'll hit our heads against the wall for as long as possible until it starts to break down. So I think on some level, it's absolutely what we're talking about. It's appetite for risk, it's scale up capital, it's all those things. I think there's also a part of me questions whether, given how successful we've been in oil, like is oil still the natural path forward? You have to think so, right? Oil isn't going anywhere anytime soon unless we're forced to stop extracting it, which has sort of been the case for a while. But part of me wonders, like, alongside oil, is there a case to be made for a new national mission for Scotland? It certainly feels that way in Aberdeen without oil. And it's not super clear to me what that is. I think it has to be built on entrepreneurship. It has to be built on business. And I think you look at everything that's happening with AI just now, the case I would make would be for that. You think about all the benefits that we have. You have natural resources, you have renewables, you have all the talent that's here as a consequence of that. And you almost copy paste that onto the AI industry. And to me, you're like, well, actually, there's a super easy answer here. Are we willing to invest in that? If we were, it wouldn't even just be the case of Scotland, because actually you could start to import people here because everything we have at the same time.
Yeah, Chris, can I just come on back on that? Because to finish the point I was trying to make there as well, because I think you've just touched on something really important, is that, I always remind people that when we talk about oil and gas, it's actually what it unlocks in the supply chain. Now that supply chain can support the acceleration of renewables. So, a lot of technologies are easily transferable here. And I'll give you a great example. Aberdeen's now home to, the world's first national floating innovation centre, where they're basically testing rigs. Companies are testing different rigs, different hexapods, straining systems to support floating wind. As I keep saying on this bloody podcast, is that the opportunities, the commercialization of those technologies is still some way off. And so what we're doing just now, we're losing a lot of our critical mass, our expertise, our innovators, our entrepreneurs who've done so well in oil and gas before such time that they can transfer and make money out of renewables, because the projects just aren't available at commercial scale. It's absolute madness. And another thing, I'm in London now, as I said earlier, Callum. It's really frustrating. I was having a discussion last night with somebody from the Treasury over dinner. And they were saying, yes, well, our data doesn't show that you're losing jobs in the Northeast. Or sorry, that's what they said. Our data doesn't show that there's economic inactivity in the Northeast. And they're right, it doesn't. But what they're not realizing is that those jobs are not going people that they're going on the dole queue. They're going off to the Middle East. They're going off to Norway. They're going off to America. Just for highly paid jobs. We're losing the talented people that we need. We're losing people like Chris that we need in our ecosystem to develop and commercialize interesting, innovative technological solutions. That's the problem we're facing now. We've got a flight of talent and we've got a flight of capital. And unless we reverse that, we're going to be in real difficulty going forward.
Yeah. Chris, in terms of your own experience then, we've heard about you heading to the US, finding investment, turning this thing into a huge success. Can you sort of help us understand, is there benefit to Scotland today from Firstbase and what Firstbase is achieving and has achieved? And is that as big, I suppose, a contribution as it could have been had the environment in Scotland been more sort of attractive?
Yeah, I think outside of, I still spend the majority of my time here. We have 2 or 3 other people dotted around Aberdeen and the rest of the UK. Not really, right? So there's some tax benefit because there's a few jobs that are here. The reality is they could be anywhere in the world. It's sort of happenstance that they're here as opposed to a strategic decision. When you take Firstbase's footprint, obviously we got acquired last year, so we're inside a much bigger company now. AppDirect's approaching 2,000 people. Firstbase is around about 100 and just short of 100. I would have loved 90% of those jobs to be here, and I think to Jeff's point, like the flight of jobs is a massive problem, certainly in the Northeast. But I think if you take the sort of a broader spectrum look at Scotland, it's similar, right? What we lack are high-paying jobs, right? And generally, they're going to be in the technology sector, in the service sector, oil and gas sector. Those can go anywhere. They're going to go to the regions that are producing oil. Similar with technology. If you're building technology products, you can be sat anywhere in the world because you do your work on a laptop. Scotland's an incredible place, right? I love living here. It's safe. My kids go to school here. Education's, I think, good relative to many other places in the world. So the reasons why people would come here, they exist, right? But unfortunately, you can't force people out by not doing anything. And I think that's part of the problem. Like, we've made it hard for people to do the things that they want to do here. I think Jeff's obviously got a bunch of friends in the political arena. I have a bunch of friends in the technology sector, particularly British and Scottish people. And it's not that they don't want to be here. Like, let's make that absolutely clear. It's not that they want to leave. It's that the opportunities to build the things that they believe and are capable of doing are just not here. And that's the sad thing, because they actually do want to be here.
Yeah, and that is so that is heartbreaking, actually, if we were to make it poetic. If people want to stay here but they feel they can't, Jeff, that's a real issue.
Yeah, look, fundamentally, I've loved this conversation, and I'd love to develop it a lot further, because I think it's so central to what we want to aspire to be as a country. But creating opportunity, right? If you create opportunity, people will find a will, they'll find a way. And right now, I just feel that we don't view business, commerce, industry in that lens. We view it in how we, the first thought from a government, be it in Holyrood, be it Westminster, is how we can ensure that we get the return from that business, from that industry, instead of thinking about how we can really catalyze it to grow and prosper and take risk and bring that pool of investors together to unlock the capability of individual companies and sectors. And I feel that opportunity is just not being presented just now. And I feel maybe just perhaps, and this is maybe we're going a wee bit off piste here slightly, but perhaps when we think about our politics, we consider too much stricture and framework that people have to go through. And I just like when you've got innovative people, entrepreneurs, these people that are given the opportunity to fly, and if we just don't allow them to do that, in my opinion, I don't have the answer immediately on the top of my head, except to say I want Chris to return to Aberdeen and bring 90% of his employees with him. I'll find him a space.
And Chris, it's worth saying, I mean, you do quite a bit when you're sort of encouraging others to start businesses and advising and guiding and all that sort of stuff. So the other part of that, I guess, is that Scottish success leads to further Scottish success, because there is a willingness to share experience and expertise, as you've just done on this podcast over the last 20 minutes.
I think so, Colin. I think, unfortunately, and this might be a separate component, we spend a lot of time navel gazing to places that we'll never be able to replicate. So I think it's easy for it's easy for people in Scotland, the government, the private sector, the public sector, to sit here and gaze towards the US and say, well, why not replicate Silicon Valley in Scotland?
Yeah.
And it's impossible. There's no world in which anything like that ever happens here. And I think it's fundamentally the wrong way to look, right? If you look the other way, you look east, you look at Estonia or Israel or Scandinavia, and you look at what countries a similar scale to Scotland are doing, how are they able to do what we have failed at? And how are they able to do it in a way that is replicated over not just 1 or 2 years, but over decades, right? And I think it's exactly what you're talking about. It's people that have built something, reinvesting in the community, giving back giving back both in terms of capital and expertise. And when you do it once, like that cycle generally starts to self propel. So you have one success leads to 3 successes. The key is like having people that have been around these types of businesses who are sat there thinking, well, Chris isn't that smart. Like, I can do what Chris has done. I can work as hard. I've seen what it takes. I now have the relationships. I've been around executives, generally from the States, who have shown me the path. And I think that is it's not a 1 or 2 year thing, right? We can't solve this in sort of one throw of the dice. It's a 5, 10, 15, 20-year things where the investments you make today are going to be the things that pay you back 5 or 10 years from now. And I think that's the thing. Like, there's no one solution here. Like everything else in life, there's no silver bullet. But I think there are small incremental changes you can make everywhere, which 10 or 15 years from now, our kids and our grandkids at least have the choice to stay and build in Scotland, which it feels like they don't have today.
Chris, it's so good to speak to you. Thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, good to see you guys.